Hello, welcome to the second video lecture. Today we're going to be talking about inverse functions. So given a function, the inverse of it, the inverse of f, which we denote being f to the negative 1 of x, will be the function formed by reversing all ordered pairs in f. So what we can say is if f of x is equal to y, then for the inverse, it gets flipped. F inverse of y will be equal to x. So we can see some examples of this. Like if f of 2 is equal to 5, then what is f inverse of 5? We said they flip. So f inverse of 5 would be 2. If f of negative 1 is 1, then what is f inverse of 1? They would flip. So f inverse of 1 would be negative 1. And finally, if f of 0 is a half, then f inverse of 1/2, we'd flip, would be 0. This works if we're given an f and an f inverse possibility. But what if we want to determine whether two equations are inverses of each other? How would we determine whether those are actual functional inverses? And what we're going to do is we're going to use our function composition, our f of g of x, right? Which again is just f of g of x. And so here's a theorem. If f and g are functions that satisfy this function composition relationship, if f composed with g of x is just equal to x, and if g composed with f of x is just equal to x, then we can definitively say that f and g will be inverses of each other. So if the inverse exists, right, if we can find a g of x that happens, what we'll do is we call that g of x f inverse of x. And again, we get that same result. F of f inverse of x will end up being x if we simplify that function inverse, and f inverse of f of x, right? F inverse composed with f will also just be x. And so the question is, how can we find this inverse? And we have these 4 steps. When we start, we'll change f of x to y. And then what we'll do is we'll solve that equation for x. So in the first step, we'll have some function that looks like y equals. And at the end, our goal is to have some function that looks like x equals. What we want to do is interchange all of the instances of x and y. By that time, we'll have back again a y equals, and then we'll substitute an f inverse for a y. And so our thing will look like f inverse of x. And so let's do a quick example. If I want to find the inverse of this function, I will change my f of x to y. So y is equal to the cubed root of x plus 4. I'll solve for x. If I have a cubed root, the way I would solve for cubed root is I would just cube both sides. Y cubed is equal to x plus 4. I'll subtract a y cubed over, and I'll subtract an x. So I'll get negative x is equal to 4 minus y cubed. And I want to solve for x, so what I can do is multiply everything by a negative. So I'll get x is equal to negative 4 plus y cubed. I've solved for my x. Let me write it up here. I'll interchange my x and y. So what that literally means is where there's x, I want to put a y. And when there's a y, I want to put an x. So my equation now looks like y is equal to negative 4 plus x cubed. And finally, to finish off, I'll get that y and write it as f inverse of x, negative 4 plus x cubed. And this is my function inverse. Now let's try one more example. Here, we want to find the inverse for this function. F of x is equal to 3 divided by x plus 1, or 1 plus x. right? So what we'll do is we change our f of x to y, and then we'll solve for x. What we would do here is we would cross multiply, right? We said 1 is always kind of an implied denominator. So what we do is we cross multiply. Y times 1 plus x is equal to 3. I want to eventually solve for x, so what I'll have to do is I'll have to distribute that y. Y plus xy is equal to 3. Again, I want to solve for this x, so I want to get that xy by itself. So I'll have to subtract that y term. I'll get 3 minus y. And now if I want to solve for x, I can divide both sides by y. And I'll get x is equal to 3 minus y divided by y. So I've solved for x. And now again, I interchange all of the x's with y's and all of the y's with x's. So my new equation becomes y is equal to 3 minus x divided by x. And finally, I change my y to an f inverse of x. And so my function inverse, f inverse of x, is equal to 3 minus x divided by x. Hopefully you found this helpful, and I will see you in class.